Hi guys, it's Matt here from Maxon UK, and in this second part of the tutorial we are going to be adding texture to our pumpkin character. Okay, so to start off with, I'm going to create a brand new material and I'm going to apply it directly to the subdivision surface. Okay, so I want it to cover the entire of my pumpkin. And we're going to be working to start with on adding in a little bit more sort of detail to the geometry using a displacement map. So by double clicking this, okay, you need to put a tick in the box that says displacement. Okay, and then we're going to add in a noise channel. So just going to go straight into there. Okay, and what you need to be aware of is the scale that we're working on. So I'm going to up that quite a lot. So in my previous one, I think it was, I had it at 400, and then I think it was 200, 400 and 200. Okay, and that should give a nice amount of waviness that doesn't look too, sort of small for it. But you are going to need to make sure that you include subpolygon displacement so that it will warp the subdivisions under the subdivision surface. So if we just do a quick render of that and see how that looks. Okay, you can see that it does sort of crinkle some of these edges a bit and stops it from looking, too clean. You also need to make sure that you've got round geometry on as well. So if I do another quick render, you can see that that is it's much smoother than it was before, and it just gives a little bit more variation to your character. And you can choose the level of subdivision if you want a bit more detail, or if it's warping it too much you may want to lower that so that it's only doing a little bit of warp, but it will add a little bit more sort of variation and stop it looking quite so clean and basketball like. Okay, then we're going to add in some bump. So let's get some surface texture in there. So click in the bump, and then we are going to add another form of noise. Okay, so just double click, and we're going to use our little drop down here, and we're going to hover over hammer. Okay, you can see that that gives us a nice sort of interesting warping texture that does sort of look like the top of a pumpkin. I am, however, going to reverse those colours, so by making that white and then making that black, and that's going to give us our bump. Now you can see the way this is applying it, it's a little bit all over the shop, so that's the way this is being applied. So if I click on that and look at my tag, we have a spherical object. So out of all of my mapping tools, I'm going to choose spherical. And you can see that that maps itself slightly better, but it's a little bit too large. So I'm just going to go to my coordinates, and I find that just shrinking that down to 10 by 10 by 10 makes a little bit of a difference. And then when it comes to my offset and my length of this texture, I'm going to go to 5 and 5. You can see that that starts to give a much more realistic looking bump texture to our character. Okay, cool. So if we do a quick render of that again, okay, so we've got a much more mottled texture, and you can see that that displacement is having a much better effect now on my pumpkin. So let's have a look at working on the color channel then. Okay, so at the moment we've just got a white texture, but what we really need is some form of color. I'm going to steal this because it's the right sort of shape. So what this does, this sort of white texture, white color, makes up the sort of interwoven layers that there seems to be on a pumpkin surface, and the darker one sort of shows where the pith comes through. So I'm going to paste that into here, and then I'm going to change their colors, and the colors I used were 28, 100, 100, and then a slightly lighter one, so about 30 and 75 and 100, and that gives this nice two-tone sort of texture to my pumpkin, which maps in with the bump because it's exactly the same texture that we're using between one and the other. But that doesn't give us an awful lot of detail, and it doesn't make stuff darker, and it doesn't work through or make it sort of, you know, dingier. So what I did to make stuff better was I added in layers. So if I just click layer and then I go into here, I made a copy of this and I pasted it, and the underneath one I made a sort of green, a darky sort of green, but I left that one lighter, almost exactly the same colour, so that when it shows through, it only shows through under sort of like the as if the skin has gone a funny colour. Okay, so I chose that, but we need to get one to show through the other. So to do that, I used a shader, and what I used was an effect, ambient occlusion, and I used that in between the two as a layer mask. So that what happens is where it is a certain way round, okay, like ambient occlusion, where it gets darker, it will let stuff through. So if I just do a quick render there, where it is darker, you can see that we get that green coming through. So if I just fill that through, okay, it hasn't quite had an effect on the inner layer that I was after. So if I just go into my ambient occlusion, okay, I didn't want it coming through completely, so I made that a lighter grey. Ooh, and I moved it over. So if I make that somewhere around there, and then I shade that in, and then I did self-shadowing evaluation, sorry, self-shadowing only, and then did another end. It just means that it gets a little bit darker and some of that colour starts to show through. The other thing I did whilst I was modelling this was I changed my renderer. So I moved into the physical renderer to work a little bit more realistically, and I also added in Global Illumination. So to work towards this and have it all nicely lit better for me to test my realism, I went into the content browser and I looked for the Lightbox, which then gave me a more realistic result when it came to rendering, and because it was nicely lit. So I brought that into the file, and let's have a look. So whilst I may have not checked my position before pressing render, nonetheless you can see the difference that that makes for the skin texture and the way it looks. So let me just lower my Lightbox a bit, and then if I unhide it I'll be able to know where it is. So there we go. If we have it a little bit lower, you can see how quickly that made a difference, and I've done nothing more. That's still our texture here, and it's only got those two layers in, one being used as a layer mask and so on and so forth. It just allows us to kind of bring stuff through. I'm going to lower this a little bit so that it brings a little bit more of that underlayer through anyway, even without the ambient occlusion. But it's too nice and clean, so what I'm going to do is add in another colour, and it was just a simple colour. So if I click that and then I go into my layer, and I'm going to use something in the sort of like the brown spectrum, 47 and then 35, okay, somewhere around there. It gives a nice dark brown, which is going to be a colour that's going to kind of seep through, so that it's got a little bit more tonal variation to him. And then we need another noise, because we're going to use that in between there and there. So it will read this first, and then it will get taken away by a layer mask. You can see that that brings that through, but that noise is, you know, not the right sort of noise. So the noise I used was displaced Voronoi. Oh no, yes, displaced Voronoi down there. Okay, and then that gave a little bit more of the sort of weaved and woven texture that I was after. But what I need to do is just lower its strength. I don't want it coming through too much, and the layer mask I'm using sort of on a light-ish fashion. So I want to bring it through but not too much. So if I just do another quick render, okay, there we go. So you can see it just gives him a little bit more texture, so he's not quite such a, you know, photoshopped style pumpkin made to be all lovely and orange. So let's have a look at working on our reflectance now. So it's very simple. So I'm quite happy with our colour, I'm quite happy with our bump. We've got lovely displacement, which is sort of crinkling our edges. So let's have a look at the reflectance now. Okay, so a pumpkin has a sort of lowish area of shine, but it is quite shiny. They've got a very sort of waxy sort of sheen to them, so that will give that sort of reflective shine. I also did add a Beckman as well, so whilst he is not Terminator 2 pumpkin and nowhere near that shiny, I do need to just like tone that down an awful lot, but there is an ever so slight reflection to him that will just give a little bit of shine and reflection, but a lot of rough sort of surface so that it isn't quite so reflective as we need. I also went down the bottom, okay, and I added under the Fresnel a dielectric because he's not a conductor, but I toned that down about 50% so that it didn't come through, and I ticked invert. So this is what the settings that I used to give him his sort of look. I'm going to do a quick scene adjustment here, so I'm going to just look at the bottom, and then I'm going to make sure, yeah, I've got my area shadows in, and I've got my left reflection and right reflection. He just looks a little bit dark on the front, so I might just increase that a tad. There we go. And then I'm going to do another quick render. This time I'll do it in the picture viewer so we can compare and contrast later. Okay, cool. So there we go. We've got our nice little pumpkin texture working on there, and he's nice and shiny, which sort of works for me, looking like a relatively cool pumpkin. Let's work on the stalk now, shall we? So what I did quite simply was I copied and pasted that material, made a darker version, and then I took the colour and I made this a little bit more sort of, well, I made it blacky brown basically, and this is a slightly lighter colour. If you look at stuff, it may not be quite that light, I might make it a little bit more pinky, and that will act as the stalk, which is, you know, a very similar sort of material, but it turns into a rougher, harder version, so it's like it's gone off. So that's what this colour is working to do. It's nowhere near as shiny, so I shall turn off the specular there, the reflectance there, and I shall lower its specular because I don't think it's really got the same sort of sheen to it. It's not quite as waxy. And then what I shall do is I go to my sphere and I shall select the polygon on the top, and U and Y and U and Y and U and Y again, and that will give me the polygons on the top, and then I shall select and I shall set selection. But to make sure that I get it so that it doesn't overwrite the pumpkin one that is going through this one, and the reason why I'm using that is so that the subdivision surface can use the subdivision of the subdivision surface, so the displacement subdivision that I've put on the texture can displace the subdivisions here. So I need to drag and drop this to the subdivision surface, oops, but then I need to restrict it to the tag on there, and that will carry that out, so I'm only working on that particular area, and we're getting our stalk here. Okay, and I might just change that from UV mapping to cylindrical. And again, might adjust my settings so it's similar to the other one, so that we get our crinkleness at the similar scale to that one. And I'm just going to do a quick render region so we can see how that looks. Okay, that's definitely not the right scale. So let's have a quick look at that. So let's change the coordinates, because I find that that will enable me to change this sometimes. So now do another quick render region. There we go. That's a bit better. One thing I might do just ever so quickly is just increase that polygon selection a little bit further, so that that brown sort of goes into that area a bit better. Okay, so it blends itself. Oh, maybe not. So that we just get that look. But depending on where you're looking and stuff, you can choose to do that. You may wish to adjust where that line is. You know, I could do a quick loop, and then I could lower it so that it warps its way in a bit better from the angle that we were previously viewing it at. Okay, which was that one. Okay, so there he is. Now, what pumpkin wouldn't be complete without a light on the inside? So I'm just going to create a quick standard light, and I'm just going to make sure that it is in the center of my pumpkin. There we go, that's cool. And I'm going to use an orangey light, so that the idea he's got a candle on the inside, and make sure that my shadow is set to area. Now at the moment, this inner part of the pumpkin, sort of fruit itself rather than the skin, is currently the same texture as the subdivision surface, whereas really it would have its own texture. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another texture, and we're going to look at how to give that a little bit more effect, as well as add some subsurface scattering to give a little bit more realism to the look of that fruit. So what I did was I took my orange one and I copied and pasted. Now is sort of half a dozen of whether or not it's easier or not. And then I looked at this one. So I kept the displacement, which is what I wanted, so it was easier to work on. And then under the bump, I changed it completely. So I used FBM, which gives you a nice grainy texture, and I threw that right down to 10. Okay, so that there was so much grain in there that it looks a little, it's nowhere near a sort of light bumpy. It should be a fine bump to that. Reflectance, I turned off that, and I lowered this so that it wasn't quite as shiny, because it isn't sort of a waxy material, but it does allow light to pass over it a little bit more. And then under the colour, I cleared that out, and I chose a lightish flesh style colour, which is very similar in colour to what the inside of a pumpkin is. You might make it a little bit more orange if you want to. It's up to you, depending on what sort of pumpkin you're looking at, they do sort of change. But then what I did, under the luminance channel, put a tick in the box to say I should be luminant, but that's obviously not what I want. And under the textures, I went for effects, and I went for subsurface scattering. So if we just double click that and have a look in our settings, we can have a look at a variety of things. Now you've got some presets here which could work for you. I think I chose something like potato as a rough idea, but then I did change its colour so that it was a little bit more like we would expect. And then under single I enabled, and we can start to get that sort of illuminant, like there is a light coming from behind it, like it's letting light through it, like it should do, being the fact that there is a light behind it and it's that sort of material. So you can choose its path length, which allows how thick it is before the light will dissipate and stop coming through. And you might choose to make some stuff lighter. What I will now do, let's have a look at the sphere. So I'm going to just select the polygons on the inside as well as those on the edge. So bear with me a second. So I'm just going to select the inside polygons. Okay, so that should do it. There we go. We should have a nice selection of polygons. Now I'm just going to align my normals, as I think they might be the wrong way around. Yes. So there we go. That's a bit better. And now I have to reselect my polygons again. So bear with me a second. Okay, there we go. And once again, I shall select and set selection, and I shall call this name inside. And let's drag and drop our texture onto our subdivision surface, and then ensure that it's only behaving on that selection. Okay, and as I've done with the others, I'm going to change its coordinates to 10 by 10 by 10 so that it shrinks, and it should be a lot smaller than it needs to be, than it comes out at. So 5%, 5%. Okay, let's have a look there. So I'm just going to zoom out again. I'm going to unhide the tabletop, and let's do another render and see where we are. So there we go. You can sort of see the difference that we get between one and the other, and the nice illumination that we get with this skin. Now you can see, because I didn't apply it to the apply that texture directly to the inside, that we get this little skin thickness, and you can control that by using the position of the polygons that you have applied that texture to. Okay. Well, I hope that was a useful tutorial for you, and you have a spookily wonderful Halloween, and I will catch you next time. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe or check out blog.maxon.co.uk.